There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a man when everything he has ever believed in collapses at once. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of a mind trying desperately to catch up with a reality it never prepared itself for. That is the silence I lived in the night I came home early. The night I learned that the two people I trusted most in the world had spent months carefully building a trap with my name on it. My name is Daniel. And until 3 days before my wedding, I truly believed I was one of the lucky ones. I had spent 5 years building a life with a woman named Sarah. 5 years of shared meals, late-night conversations, weekend road trips, and quiet mornings where we would sit with coffee and talk about the future we were going to build together. I had a good job I was proud of, an apartment we had filled with memories, and a best friend named Mark who had been beside me through nearly every important moment of my adult life. From the outside, and even from the inside, my life looked exactly the way I had always hoped it would. I was happy. I was genuinely, completely happy. And that is the most painful part of everything that followed, because the happiness was real. The betrayal was just hidden behind it. Mark and I had met during our first week of college. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately made everyone feel at ease. Quick with a joke, generous with his time, and fiercely loyal. Or at least, that is what I believed for more than a decade. We had been through everything together, cramming for exams at 2 a.m, celebrating our first real jobs, supporting each other through breakups and disappointments, and all the ordinary struggles that come with growing up. He was my brother in every way that mattered. When people asked me who I would call if I ever needed help at 3 a.m, the answer was always Mark, without hesitation. Sarah came into my life 3 years after that. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. She laughed at something I said, something that, honestly, was not even that funny. And I remember thinking that I wanted to spend a very long time making her laugh like that. We started slowly, the way good things often do. Coffees that turned into long walks. Phone calls that stretched past midnight. A first trip together that felt, even then, like the beginning of something real. By the end of our first year together, I could not imagine my life without her in it. By the end of our second year, I had already started quietly looking at rings. When I proposed, she cried. She held my face in both her hands and cried. And I remember feeling like the luckiest man alive in that moment. I called Mark immediately after. He told me he had never heard me sound happier. He said he was proud of me. He said Sarah was the best thing that had ever happened to me. Those words, looking back now, carry a very different weight. The warning signs, I now understand, had been accumulating for months. But the thing about warning signs is that they are almost impossible to see clearly when you are standing inside the picture. You have to step outside it first. And I had no reason to step outside. I trusted Sarah completely. I trusted Mark with my life. So when the two of them began spending more time together during the wedding planning, I told myself it was nothing. Told myself it was practical. Mark was helping with logistics while I worked long hours. He had good organizational skills. It made sense. But there were moments, small moments I dismissed almost as soon as they appeared, that now replay in my memory with a terrible clarity. The way a conversation would sometimes stop abruptly when I entered a room. The way Sarah's phone would be turned face down whenever I sat beside her. The way Mark would occasionally grow just slightly quieter when I mentioned the wedding. I noticed these things. I registered them somewhere in the back of my mind, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that this is what love looks like. This is what trusting someone looks like. You don't interrogate the people you love over nothing. And then came the night 3 days before the wedding. I had been away on a short business trip and managed to wrap things up a day early. I did not call ahead. I wanted to surprise Sarah, to walk through the door and see her face light up. I was genuinely excited. I even stopped at a bakery on the way home and bought the almond croissants she loved. That is the version of me who walked back into that apartment, a happy man carrying pastries, counting the minutes until he could see his fiancée. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside. The lights were low. For a moment I thought maybe Sarah had gone out, and I felt a small flicker of disappointment. But then I heard voices coming from the direction of the bedroom. At first I could not make sense of it, and then I heard it, a voice I would recognize anywhere, in any room, under any circumstances. It was Mark. My brain refused the information at first. There had to be an explanation. Maybe he had stopped by to drop something off. Maybe there was a completely ordinary reason why my best friend's voice was coming from my bedroom. I moved slowly toward the door, telling myself with every step that I was about to feel very foolish for even thinking what I was thinking. Then I heard Sarah laugh, a soft, familiar laugh, and she said, "Don't worry. After the wedding, he'll sign the house papers anyway." The world stopped. And then Mark replied, "Good. Then we can finally stop pretending." I stood in my own hallway, holding a paper bag of almond croissants, and I felt something inside me go completely still. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of a machine that has just received information it has no framework to process. I do not know how long I stood there. It might have been 10 seconds. It might have been 2 minutes. Time had stopped behaving normally. Every instinct I had told me to open that door, to walk in, to confront them, to demand an explanation, to let them see that I had heard everything. But something else stopped me, a quieter, colder part of my brain that suddenly woke up and said, "Wait. If you walk in there now, they will lie. They will explain it away. They will turn this back on you and call you paranoid, jealous, irrational, and you will have nothing but your word against theirs. So instead of opening that door," I set the paper bag down silently on the kitchen counter, walked back out of the apartment, and sat in my car in the parking lot for the next 4 hours. Sitting in that car was one of the strangest experiences of my life. I did not cry. I did not make phone calls. I did not even turn the radio on. I just sat there in the dark and tried to think through everything I had believed to be true, and everything that had just been dismantled. 5 years, an engagement, a wedding 3 days away, a best friendship of more than a decade, all of it suddenly existing in 2 versions simultaneously. The version I had lived, and the version that had apparently been running beneath it the entire time. I thought about the small moments I had dismissed, the way they looked at each other sometimes, the conversations that stopped when I walked in, the locked phone, the text message I had accidentally glimpsed that night at the dinner table. Just 3 words from Mark. "Miss you already." I had told myself that night that it probably meant nothing, that friends said things like that I was reading into it. Now I understood that I had not been reading into anything. I had been reading it exactly right. I had simply chosen not to believe what I saw. When I finally went back upstairs that night, I made a decision that I believe was the most important decision I would make in the weeks that followed. I decided not to show them that I knew. I would go back inside. I would act normal. I would smile and kiss Sarah goodnight and text Mark back as if nothing had happened. And while they continued performing the roles of devoted fiancé and loyal best friend, I would quietly begin collecting the truth. Sarah was asleep when I got back. She stirred when I came into the bedroom and murmured that she was glad I was home. I told her I was glad to be back. I got into bed beside her and stared at the ceiling for most of the night, listening to her breathe, trying to understand how the person sleeping next to me had become someone I no longer recognized at all. The weeks that followed were among the strangest of my life. I played the role of a man who had no idea his world had already ended. I went to wedding planning meetings and offered opinions on centerpieces. I laughed at Mark's jokes over dinner. I held Sarah's hand when we walked together, and all the while, the calm, cold part of my brain that had taken over in that hallway continued gathering evidence. I installed a small hidden camera in the living room. I want to be honest about the fact that this was not an easy decision. There was still a part of me, a part I am not ashamed of, that desperately wanted to be wrong. That still held on to the possibility, however small, that what I had heard was somehow being misunderstood. I installed the camera not out of certainty, but out of the need to know the truth completely and undeniably, because I knew that if this ever came to light, they would deny it, and I needed to make sure that denial would not be possible. When I checked the footage several days later, the last fragment of hope I had been carrying disappeared. Sarah and Mark were on the couch together in the middle of the afternoon. They kissed. They laughed together with the easy comfort of two people who had been doing this for a long time. And then Mark said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He looked at Sarah and said, "He's too trusting. He deserves this." Those words did something unexpected to me. They did not break me. They clarified me, because in that moment, I understood something that I think anyone who has ever been deeply betrayed eventually comes to understand. The cruelest part of being deceived by someone you love is not the deception itself. It is discovering that the person doing it believed, on some level, that you deserved it, that your trust, the very quality you thought made you a good friend, a good partner, a good man, was the thing they used against you and pitied you for. After that, I stopped grieving and I started planning. The plan I put in place over the following weeks was careful and methodical. First, I called my lawyer, a woman I trusted and who had helped me with contract work in the past, and told her what was happening. Together, we had the house transferred into a legal trust in my name alone, structured in a way that was fully protected before the wedding date. Any claim Sarah might have had disappeared the moment those documents were finalized. The prenuptial agreement she had already signed, which she had agreed to without much pushback, which now made a grim kind of sense, ensured that she would receive nothing from our shared assets in the event of divorce or separation under circumstances of infidelity. While I was doing all of this legally and quietly, I was also building the archive. Every piece of evidence I had collected, the camera footage, the screenshots of messages, the audio recordings of their conversations discussing their plans for after the wedding, I compiled into a single file, organized, dated, undeniable. And then I thought about what I wanted the moment of truth to look like. Part of me had considered simply calling off the wedding privately, sitting Sarah down, showing her what I knew, and ending things quietly before another person ever had to witness it. That would have been clean, dignified, the version of events where I walk away with my head held high, and my private pain stays private. But I kept coming back to something that I could not let go of. They had not kept things private. They had not been quiet about what they were doing. They had been planning openly in my home, in my living room, on my couch, while friends and family were traveling from across the country to celebrate a wedding they were happy to let happen as long as it served their purposes. The deception had not been a private thing. It had been performed every single day in front of everyone who knew us, so I decided the truth should not be private either. I contacted the wedding venue and asked if they could accommodate a special video presentation during the reception. They were enthusiastic. They thought it was romantic. When I mentioned it to Sarah, casually, as if it had just occurred to me, She smiled and kissed me on the cheek and said it was the most thoughtful thing I had ever planned. She assumed it would be a love story, a montage of photographs and memories, the way these things usually are. She had no idea that every clip I had chosen told a very different story. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather, the kind of morning that makes everything look like a photograph. Sunlight came through the tall windows of the ceremony hall and fell in warm strips across the rows of white chairs. Flowers were arranged exactly as Sarah had wanted. The music was playing softly. Guests arrived in their best clothes, greeting each other with hugs and laughter, filling the room with the particular warmth of people who have gathered to celebrate love. My parents were there. My mother had called me 3 times that morning already. Once to make sure I had eaten breakfast, once to tell me how proud she was, and once just to hear my voice. My father, who was not a man who used many words, had pulled me aside before the ceremony and told me he had never seen me look so at peace. He meant it as a compliment. He had no idea how right he was, and for entirely different reasons than he imagined. Sarah walked down the aisle in her white dress, and she was genuinely beautiful. I want to say that honestly because honesty matters more to me than the comfort of pretending otherwise. She looked exactly the way I had once imagined she would look on our wedding day. Standing at the altar, watching her walk toward me, I allowed myself one final moment of mourning for the life I had believed I was building. And then that moment passed, and I was simply present, calm, clear-eyed, and ready for what came next. Mark stood beside me as Beast Man. He straightened my collar before the ceremony began and told me I looked great. He smiled through the whole ceremony with the practiced ease of someone who had spent months perfecting the role. I watched him from the corner of my eye sometimes and marveled, genuinely marveled, at the ease of it. How completely normal he seemed, how entirely comfortable in his deception. I thought about the words he had said on that video. He's too trusting. He deserves this. I thought about that sentence every time he smiled at me. The ceremony itself was everything they had planned it to be. We exchanged vows. We exchanged rings. The officiant said the words that are meant to join 2 people together, and the guests responded with the warmth and applause those words are designed to produce. In another version of this story, this would have been the ending, the happy one. In this version, it was only the intermission. At the reception, after the toasts and the first course had been served, I took the microphone. I thanked everyone for coming. I told them how much it meant to have people we loved travel from near and far to celebrate this day with us. I mentioned that I had prepared a very special surprise for Sarah, a video I had put together personally, something I wanted everyone to share in. Sarah looked at me with bright eyes and a smile that was completely unguarded. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I can't believe you did this," she whispered. The lights in the reception hall dimmed. The large screen at the front of the room glowed to life. The video opened exactly as Sarah expected. Photographs from our relationship filled the screen, the early ones, from trips we had taken and celebrations we had shared. Guests leaned forward in their seats. A few people were already reaching for tissues. The music underneath was gentle and warm. For the first 30 seconds, it really did look like a love story. And then the photographs stopped, and the first video clip appeared. The hall went silent so completely that I could hear the air conditioning. The footage from the living room camera filled the screen. Sarah and Mark on the couch. The conversation I had heard that first night, now captured and time-stamped. Sarah's voice, warm, relaxed, utterly at ease, saying, "After the wedding, he'll sign the house papers anyway." Mark's reply, their laughter, the intimacy of 2 people who believed themselves to be completely alone and unobserved. Someone at the back of the hall said, "Oh my God," loudly enough for half the room to hear. The video kept playing, more clips, screenshots of messages displayed on screen, expanded and clearly visible, an audio recording of Mark saying I was too trusting, another clip of the two of them discussing their plans for after the wedding with the casual confidence of people who believed their plan was airtight. The evidence unfolded in sequence, methodical and irrefutable, clip after clip after clip, while 200 people sat in stunned silence and tried to process what they were watching. I watched Sarah's face throughout. I saw the exact moment she understood what was happening. The color left her completely. Her hands, which had been folded on the table in front of her, went still. Mark had been standing near the far side of the room, and I watched him too. Watched the stillness spread through him. Watched his expression shift from confusion to recognition to something close to dread. When the video ended, the room remained silent for a long moment, and then I picked up the microphone. I said, "Don't worry, everyone. The wedding isn't canceled." Confused murmurs. People looked at each other. A few guests half rose from their seats, uncertain whether to stay or go. I looked directly at Mark and said, "Actually, I think the two of you should stay together. You've been working very hard on this relationship. It would be a shame to waste all that effort." And then I told them what I had done. 3 months earlier, when I first discovered the truth, I had transferred the house into a legal trust that Sarah had no claim to. The prenuptial agreement she had signed, and signed without hesitation as it happened, protected everything else. The wedding she had believed would be the beginning of her financial security had instead been the day it became completely inaccessible to her. The house she had already been planning to live in, the assets she had expected to share, the future she had spent months quietly orchestrating, none of it was available to her. Not 1 cent. Not 1 square foot. The silence that followed that announcement was different from the one that had followed the video. The video had produced shock. This produced something harder to name, a collective dawning recognition of the full dimensions of what had just happened. Sarah began crying. Mark walked out of the building without speaking. Family members stood frozen in the spaces between their chairs, not quite sure where to look or what to say. Some of my relatives came toward me. My mother was crying, not from sadness, I think, but from a kind of overwhelmed relief that the truth had come out before something worse could happen. My father stood very still and looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Then he nodded, once, slowly. In the weeks after the wedding that happened but was not a wedding in the way anyone had anticipated, and I had a great deal of time to think about what I had done and why. People had opinions, of course. People always have opinions about the choices others make in the worst moments of their lives. Some felt that I had gone too far, that the public nature of the revelation was unnecessarily harsh, that there was a more private and dignified way to handle the situation. I understand that perspective. I do not fully agree with it, but I understand it. What I know is this: I did not act out of rage. I acted out of a very deliberate, very considered understanding of the truth. The truth was that two people had spent months treating the trust of someone who loved them as an obstacle to be managed, a naivety to be exploited, a weakness to be pitied. They had made their plans openly in the spaces of my life while I went to work and paid bills and bought almond croissants and thought about how lucky I was. And so the answer I gave them was not cruelty, it was clarity, the truth presented completely and honestly to every person who had been gathered to witness a version of events that was entirely false. I simply replaced the false version with the real one. There is something I want to say to anyone who has ever sat in a car in a parking lot at night, staring at a steering wheel, trying to understand how their life became unrecognizable in the span of a single sentence. I want to say, the grief is real. Allow it to be real. Do not let anyone tell you that because you were deceived, you were foolish. Trust is not foolishness. It is a choice made in good faith And the failure of the person you trusted does not reflect the failure of your judgment. It reflects theirs. I also want to say, the calm that comes after grief, the cold, clear-eyed stillness that arrives when you have finished crying and started thinking, is not a weakness either. It is a form of strength that does not get named often enough. The strength that comes from deciding, I will not pretend. I will not collapse. I will not let the version of this story that survives be the one they wrote. The question people ask me most often when they hear this story is whether I regret it, whether I wish I had handled it differently, whether there is a version of events I would go back and change. The honest answer is I regret that it happened. I regret the 5 years I gave to someone who was performing love rather than living it. I regret that the person I considered my closest friend spent years looking at me and deciding I was someone who deserved to be used. Those things I will carry for a long time, and some part of them I will probably always carry. But what I did at that reception? No. I do not regret that. Not for a moment. Because there is a particular kind of peace that comes not from vengeance, and not from rage, and not from watching someone suffer the way you suffered. It comes from something much quieter than any of those things. It comes from knowing that the truth, the full, complete, irrefutable truth, is finally out in the world where it belongs. It comes from walking away from a situation with your dignity intact and your record clear, and the knowledge that you did not lie, and you did not hide, and you did not become something lesser in response to someone else's cruelty. That is what I walked away with. And in the end, in the long, quiet aftermath of that extraordinary afternoon, it turned out to be more than enough. My name is Daniel, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I finally know exactly who I am, and exactly who I am not willing to become.